This part of today's training involves the Americans with Disabilities Act and how it relates to your role as election workers. Also referred to as the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act is a comprehensive civil rights law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability and guarantees that individuals with disabilities have the same opportunities as everyone else to participate in public life. The Americans with Disabilities Act is comprised of 5 titles, or sections. Title II is most relevant to your job as election workers, since it prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all public programs, services, and activities. Today we will talk about responsibilities under the American with Disabilities Act, both those of Harris County and of you as election workers. Topics include the definition of disability under the ADA, communicating with voters, providing assistance at the vote center, requirements under Title II of the ADA, curbside voting, vote center location requirements, complaint process, and Harris County policies. What does the term disability entail? Under the ADA, disability is defined as physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. The definition of disability and the term substantially limits should be interpreted broadly. What is considered a major life activity? Speaking, standing, sitting, lifting, communicating, walking, and reaching, as well as the operation of major bodily functions, such as the neurological or immune system. Types of disabilities include hearing, speech, mental, neurological, learning, visual, intellectual, and mobility. Examples of voters with disabilities include those who use wheelchairs or other mobility devices, those who are blind or have vision loss, or those who have difficulty walking. Keep in mind that not all disabilities are outwardly visible. A voter may have cancer, mental illness, PTSD, or epilepsy, conditions that you may not see, but that fall into the definition of substantially limits one or more major life activities. In addition to someone who has a physical or mental impairment, as we just defined, the ADA also covers an individual who has a record of such an impairment, or an individual who is regarded as having such an impairment. As an election worker, you do not make the determination of who has or does not have a disability. You as an election worker should treat all voters with dignity and respect, regardless of disability, attitude, race, politics, sexual orientation, etc. If an individual with a disability chooses to vote at your location, be kind and respectful as with any voter. Never make assumptions about a voter. A voter with a neurological disability may speak or move differently. This doesn't mean they are less intelligent. Treat adults like adults. Do not display condescension to a voter or speak to them as if they were a child. The ADA requires you to uphold and respect the privacy and independence of each voter. Be friendly but not overly familiar. Don't ask personal questions, including questions about a voter's disability. Don't assume a voter with a disability needs help or that you know best how to help them. Voters with disabilities want to be treated like every other voter. If you don't know how to help or what to do, communicate with the voter. Ask, do you need assistance? Or please let me know if you need any assistance. Do not be offended if someone doesn't need or want your help. When referring to a voter, use person-first language. This means referring to a person who happens to have a particular characteristic. Examples include a woman who uses a wheelchair or a man who has PTSD. When you say the blind man or the deaf woman, you are defining that person, purposely or not, by their disability. Each voter is a unique individual who deserves to be viewed as a whole person, not by one small aspect. When speaking with a voter who requires an interpreter, address the voter, not the interpreter. Look at and speak to the voter. Do not distract a service animal or attempt to pet them. They are working for the individual, so it's important not to distract or deter the animal from performing their duties. Do not touch or move a person's mobility device. It is not appropriate to go to a voter and move their wheelchair if they haven't asked you to do that. People rely on their mobility device for their movement, and interfering with that process can cause disruption. Just as you do not want someone touching you without permission, a person using a mobility device can feel threatened or unsafe if someone touches them or the mobility device without permission. If a voter has a speech disability, don't pretend that you understand what is being said if you don't. Don't guess what the person wants to say or finish their sentences for them. It's okay to ask the person to repeat themselves and avoid speaking louder or slower. If a voter has a visual disability, provide conversation cues, such as identifying yourself when you start to speak or saying goodbye when you leave the conversation. Overall, treat all voters, regardless of gender, race, disability, religion, politics, or background, equally and with kindness and respect. Providing assistance to voters. What we've been talking about, generally providing help and support for all voters, including voters with a disability, is commonly referred to as assisting. It can include helping someone enter the vote center or voting booth, learning how to use the equipment, or providing a chair to sit in while waiting in line. In these instances, you are legally permitted and obligated to provide voters that assistance under both Texas law and Title II of the ADA. The Texas Election Code defines assisting as a specific legal term, which is narrower than Title II of the ADA. The Texas Election Code, Title VI, Chapter 64, Subchapter B, is titled Assisting Voter and specifically refers to assistance in reading and marking the ballot. This subchapter details eligibility for both requesting and providing assistance. Under this subchapter of the Texas Election Code, voter assistance is specifically defined as reading the ballot to the voter, directing the voter to read the ballot, marking the voter's ballot, or directing the voter to mark the ballot. Voters are entitled to receive assistance if they cannot read the language the ballot is written in or have a physical disability that prevents the voter from reading or marking the ballot. A voter may be assisted by any person the voter chooses who is not an election worker. This person can be a spouse, child, non-registered voter, non-citizen, etc. Or the voter may be assisted by two election workers. Voters may not be assisted by their employer, an agent of their employer, or an officer or agent of their union. The person assisting the voter must take an oath that he or she will not try to influence the voter's vote and will mark the ballot as the voter directs. For election workers, this is part of the oath they take to work the election. If the person assisting is not an election worker, once the voter has been checked in, but prior to accepting the signature on the e-poll book, the qualifying clerk will select the Assistance button. The assistant will complete their personal information, then sign the e-poll book to affirm the oath of person assisting voter. If the voter chooses to be assisted by election workers, poll watchers and election inspectors may observe the voting process. But if the voter asks to be assisted by a person the voter chooses, no one else may watch him or her vote. It is illegal for a person assisting the voter to try to influence the voter's vote, to mark the voter's ballot in any way other than the way they have asked, or to tell anyone how the voter voted. As a reminder, the voter assistance information just discussed is defined under the Texas Election Code. Now we will discuss voter assistance and reasonable modifications under Title II of the ADA. As mentioned earlier, Title II of the ADA requires state and local governments to ensure that people with disabilities have a full and equal opportunity to vote independently and confidentially. The requirements of Title II apply to all elections, including federal, state, and local elections, and all aspects of voting, from voter registration to the casting of ballots. Under Title II of the ADA, voters with disabilities have the right to vote in person, independently and privately, at a vote center location that is physically accessible, and at a physically accessible voting booth. Also under Title II, voters with disabilities have the right to receive assistance from a person of their choice or an election worker, and be provided auxiliary aids or services to ensure effective communication, be provided reasonable modifications, and be treated courteously and with respect. Under the ADA, a service animal is defined as a dog that has been individually trained to do work or Under the ADA, a service animal is defined as a dog that has been individually trained to do work or perform tasks for an individual with a disability. Service animals must be allowed in all areas of the vote center where the public is allowed, except where the dog's presence would create a legitimate safety risk or would fundamentally alter the nature of Harris County's voting program. You may also have heard the term emotional support animal. Support animals and service animals are not the same. Emotional support animals can be any animal, such as a rabbit, iguana, ferret, peacock, etc., and are not protected under the ADA, which means that you are not required to allow the animal inside the vote center. However, most emotional support animals are used to calm anxiety. So if your location doesn't prohibit animals from coming inside and the animal isn't causing a fuss, you may allow them inside. You can also suggest a drive-through location nearby so that the emotional support animal can stay with the voter while they vote. As mentioned earlier, one of the rights guaranteed to Harris County voters with disabilities is the right to vote in person. While a voter with disabilities can vote by mail if they choose, every Harris County registered voter has the right to vote in person, and voters with disabilities are no different. Title II requires the provision of reasonable modifications to policies, practices, and procedures to ensure that an individual with a disability has an equal opportunity to participate. Reasonable modifications must be made, unless doing so would result in a fundamental alteration or undue burden. Examples of providing a reasonable modification are providing a chair to a voter with a mobility disability as they wait in line, or helping a voter who is blind navigate to the voting area. In most situations, the voter should make this request, but if a person's disability and need for assistance are obvious, you may offer assistance. For example, a voter who is blind may need to be directed to the appropriate voting station. Again, as we mentioned earlier, do not be offended if the voter declines your help. Texas Election Code, Section 64.009, voter unable to enter a polling place. This section states, if a voter is physically unable to enter the vote center without personal assistance or likelihood of injuring the voter's health, on the voter's request, the election officer shall deliver a ballot to the voter at the vote center entrance or curb. As stated in the Texas Election Code, curbside voting must be provided at every vote center, including early voting locations. The rules related to curbside voting, such as designating an election worker to monitor curbside voters, whether through the receiver or standing outside, are not optional. Each vote center has a new attachment for the Duo tablet, called a Duo Go. The machine that will be used for the Duo Go should be the last Duo on the equipment line that ends closest to the door. Place the small table provided in the equipment caddy next to the Duo. Place the Duo Go on top of the table along with the ATI access device. The Duo must stay with this controller line throughout the voting period. A curbside voter will alert election workers to their presence by using the buzzer notification system. An election worker will respond immediately and direct them to the curbside voting area if it's not in the same place as the buzzer. If you have a line of voters, you will need to mark the curbside voter's place in line with green scratch paper. Hand to the last voter in line and instruct them to give the paper to the clerk when they reach the qualifying table. In addition, the workers should let the voter know that someone will be out to check them in as soon as it is their turn and that their place in line is being marked. Once it is the voter's turn, notify the curbside clerk. The clerk will take an iPad to process the voter in the curbside voting area. Qualifying a curbside voter is just like qualifying a voter inside the vote center. Follow the 6-step process to qualify the voter as you would inside. Please note, just like a voter being processed inside the vote center, a curbside voter may not have the required identification, which could require a RID or provisional ballot, or they may need to complete an SOR. You must process the curbside voter just like you would a voter inside the vote center, including completing any necessary paperwork. Once the voter is processed, the curbside clerk will take the e-poll book inside and use the barcode reader on the controller that's on the line with the Duo Go to read the barcode and produce an access code. At this point, the curbside clerk will alert either the presiding judge or alternate judge and will continue the process together. The judge will take the access code to the Duo voting device at the end of the line. On the touch screen, enter the access code. Make sure that the Duo Go is on the table next to the Duo and is open with the Velcro straps undone, ready for the tablet to be placed inside. Once the Duo screen directs you to insert the paper, unlock the tablet and remove it from the Duo case. The screen will now display Connect to Duo Go Carrier. Insert the plug located inside the Duo Go into the port on the lower side of the Duo tablet. Insert the tablet into the Duo Go cradle face down. Connect the Velcro straps across the back of the tablet. Insert a ballot sheet into the paper feeder at the top. Once the paper has stopped feeding, close the door and latch it. Remove the charger from the Duo Go. The curbside clerk and the judge will go together to take the Duo Go, the carrier envelope, and the ATI to the voter. One person should carry the Duo Go and one should carry the envelope and the ATI. Hand the Duo Go through the window to the voter. If the voter cannot or does not want to use the touchscreen, you may hand them the ATI device and direct them where to plug it in. As with a voter inside the vote center, a curbside voter may need assistance reading or marking the ballot. As discussed earlier, the voter can choose their assistant or request that election workers assist. Unless the voter has requested assistance with the ballot, election workers should stand a short distance away from the car while the voter casts their ballot. Once the voter has completed their ballot, they will select Print Record, ask to confirm, and the vote record will print. Ask the voter to confirm their choices with the printed vote record. Hand the voter the carrier envelope and ask them to place their printed ballot into the sleeve. Explain that the printed ballot must be deposited into the scan inside the vote center and that you will use the carrier envelope to take the printed ballot inside and submit it. Direct the voter to wait until you confirm that the ballot has been deposited. You will return with an I voted sticker for the voter. Take the Duo Go along with the carrier envelope back inside the vote center. Deposit the printed record into the scan. Once the screen has displayed your vote has been cast and shows the flying flag, return to the voter with the I voted sticker. The curbside clerk will remove the Duo tablet from the Duo Go by using the blue key to unlock the back of the Duo Go, unlatch the Velcro straps, disconnect the USB cord, and remove the tablet from the Duo Go. Set the tablet into the docking cradle on the Duo booth, and the LED light will turn green when properly docked. Lock the tablet in place. Reconnect the Duo Go to the AC power. Whenever the Duo Go is not being used, it should be plugged in to charge. You can check the status of the battery inside the Duo Go attachment. Now that you can process a curbside voter, let's step back to how you set up the curbside voting area. Curbside voting involves several components, including the buzzer, voting area, and accessibility of those items. We'll go into more details on these issues, but first let's lay out the pieces. Curbside voting includes the notification element, aka the buzzer, the voting area, the receiver, monitoring the receiver and the buzzer, and responding to curbside voters. Harris County provides a temporary alert system to every early voting and election day vote center. It includes a buzzer outside the vote center location and a receiver inside. When a voter pushes the buzzer, it indicates to an election worker inside the vote center that a curbside voter needs assistance. Posting the curbside buzzer is mandatory for every vote center location. Detailed step-by-step instructions are available in the ADA manual. Here is a short overview. After taking everything out of the case, including the base and sign stored under the foam filling, place the base on the ground. Retrieve the octagonal weight from on top of the caddy and place on top of the circular base. Screw the two pieces of the pole together and fully extend the top section. Screw the pole into the base. Attach the sign to the bracket with the screws and wing nuts provided. Plug the receiver inside the location where a worker can monitor. Test that the buzzer and receiver are working. Once the buzzer has been assembled and set up, place the directional curbside voting signs to direct voters to the buzzer. So where should the buzzer be placed? The outside components of curbside voting include the buzzer and the curbside voting area. They can be in the same location, but they do not have to be. To determine the best setup, consider the following. The buzzer must be accessible to the driver from within the car. The buzzer cannot block accessible parking, accessible routes, or curb ramps. The buzzer should be placed so that a voter seeking curbside voting should be able to drive through the area where they can access political representatives to receive handouts. A misconception exists that accessible parking spaces, aka those spaces reserved for people with a disability, referred to in the past as a handicap parking space, can and should be used as the curbside voting area. This is not true. Accessible parking spaces cannot be used as the curbside voting area, and the buzzer cannot be placed in or next to the accessible parking space. So why is this photo not correct? Well, the buzzer is blocking the access aisle. The buzzer is also blocking a person's ability to open their car door. And if a person with a disability parks here, which they have every right to do, then the buzzer is unavailable to voters. Here's an example of a correctly placed buzzer. The buzzer is on the curb, so it doesn't block traffic and is reachable by a driver. This is also an example of a buzzer and voting area placed in different locations. When a voter presses the buzzer, the election worker monitoring the receiver will direct them to the curbside voting area. Generally, the curbside voting area is designated in the first parking space closest to the door after the accessible parking spaces. Directional signs will be included in your supplies. Please use them to ensure that voters who need curbside voting can easily identify the buzzer. Plug the receiver into the wall or surge protector in an area where an election worker can monitor all day. This does not necessarily mean the voting room. The receiver just needs to be in an area where it works and where an election worker can monitor it. This could mean in the entry area where the greeter stands and can monitor the receiver. Test the buzzer and receiver during setup, prior to opening the polls, and throughout the voting period. If the buzzer or receiver is not working at any time, immediately call the ETC tech line to troubleshoot and replace if necessary. If the buzzer is in an accessible location but not functioning, try moving the receiver closer to the buzzer. For example, plug in the receiver at an outlet near the entrance and station an election worker to monitor the receiver throughout the election. Also, setting the receiver in a higher location, such as on a shelf, can help with reception. Remember to check throughout the day to ensure that the buzzer and receiver are working properly. If the buzzer isn't functioning, you must station an election worker in sightline of the buzzer throughout the entire election. Again, this is a requirement. You are required to have one of your workers monitor the buzzer area, whether through the receiver or, if that isn't working, then outside in full view of the buzzer. As mentioned earlier, Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act mandates that individuals with disabilities have the opportunity to fully participate in voting. The ADA's provisions apply to all aspects of voting, including the physical vote location. As the local public entity conducting the election, Harris County must ensure that during early voting and on Election Day, all vote center locations are in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, referring to the capacity of a building, parking space, voting room, or pathway to be utilized by an individual with a disability. When choosing vote center locations, Harris County ADA staff visit the location to ensure that it is ADA compliant. Some locations, like churches, are not required to comply with ADA. So Harris County staff identifies temporary remedies to make the location compliant for early voting or election day. Temporary remedies can include items like portable ramps, door stops, cord covers, signage, cones, or mats. They are placed temporarily, which for you means throughout the early voting or election day, to ensure that individuals with disabilities can access the vote center location. Harris County ADA staff then compile the items to be addressed and the remedies to be applied into a checklist for each location. Implementation of these remedies is mandatory to ensure that all voters have the opportunity to fully participate in the voting process. The ADA checklist is part of the e-poll book, accessible through the main menu on the iPad. Specific to your vote center location, each screen of the checklist will identify a single remedy and who is responsible, either the judge or a vendor. If the remedies are substantial, like installing a temporary ramp, an outside vendor will deliver and install them. The ADA checklist on your e-poll book will also include an aerial diagram to help you implement the temporary remedies by showing van accessible parking, accessible routes, and placement of temporary remedies. The diagram also includes a legend showing what each symbol means. You must follow the diagram. For each remedy, instructions and photos will also be displayed to show you exactly how the temporary remedy must be implemented. You must take a photo through the iPad to verify that the remedy is correctly in place. Your photo must match the photo provided in the checklist. The Harris County ADA staff are then able to check the photos and notes to ensure compliance. For early voting locations, you will need to complete the e-poll book ADA checklist at setup and every day of early voting. While Harris County staff pre-check the locations and develop temporary remedies, the early voting and election day workers share accountability for ensuring that vote center locations have no impediments for voters, with the ultimate responsibility lying with the presiding judge. The following are the ADA requirements and the temporary remedies used to bring a location into compliance. At least one van accessible space must be provided at each vote center location. A van accessible parking space means a designated accessible parking space with an adjacent access aisle. A sign must be posted at the head of the space that includes the international symbol of accessibility and the words van accessible. The parking space must have no obstructions. If the vote center location does not have a compliant van accessible parking space, you will need to set up a temporary parking space. Follow all the directions in your e-poll book checklist. The diagram, instructions, and photos will specify exactly where the temporary van accessible space must be set up. You must create the temporary space according to the checklist and the photos. The Harris County ADA staff have reviewed the location to determine the most appropriate location for the temporary space. An access aisle is a vital part of a van accessible parking space. The access aisle allows the voter who uses a wheelchair to descend from their van using a lift or ramp. To create an access aisle, place cones at the bottom of the space, meaning the edge of the space closest to the vehicular way. The cones are to block a car from using the space. Do not place the cones, curbside voting buzzer, or any objects in the middle of the temporary access aisle, as this will block the voter from exiting their van. Make sure the cones are placed in a way that a person who uses a wheelchair or power chair has a 3-foot wide route between the cones and any parked cars. Post the temporary sign found in your packet at the head of the parking space so that the voters know that this is a van accessible space. If your location does not have a passenger loading zone, you are not required to create one. But if your location does have a passenger loading zone, it must meet certain requirements. Have a 5-foot wide access aisle, 8-foot wide vehicle space, be clear of obstructions, and connected to an accessible route. To provide a van accessible access aisle in a passenger loading zone, place cones to mark the temporary access aisle, placing 2 cones at each end of the access aisle to make sure that no one pulls into or blocks the access aisle. Post a temporary sign at the head of the pull-up space. Make sure the temporary passenger loading zone connects to an accessible route, meaning no curbs or obstructions. Accessible routes must be available both inside and outside of the vote center location. Accessible routes include the exterior pathways for a voter to get to and into the vote center building, as well as the interior pathways to get to the voting room. In some instances, the accessible route may not be the same route used by other voters, such as if the main entrance to your location has steps but no ramps. To ensure that a voter with disabilities has clear direction as to where an accessible entrance is located, directional signs are required. If directional signs are on your checklist, you must post them. Directional signage must mark the location of van accessible parking if it's not otherwise obvious, accessible route from the parking drop-off area, public sidewalks, public transportation, also from accessible entrances, and marking the accessible route to the voting area. All accessible routes, both inside and outside the vote center location, must meet certain requirements. The accessible route has to be at least 3 feet wide, stable, firm, and slip resistant. That means it can't include gravel or grass. It should have no protruding or overhanging objects, no abrupt level changes greater than a 1/2 inch, or openings along the route greater than a 1/2 inch. As mentioned earlier, these requirements are initially checked by Harris County staff. Your job is to ensure that the remedies are implemented properly according to your checklist. Exterior accessible routes must include routes from the accessible parking area, if parking is provided, from public transportation, if a stop is close by, from public sidewalks, if they connect to the property, and from the passenger loading zone, if there is one. Temporary remedies for inaccessible exterior voter routes include rerouting to an accessible route, placing mats with plates over gaps and against level changes, or installing temporary ramps. As you go through your checklist, it may not be clear why you must implement some of the remedies. The following are examples of temporary remedies and why they are required throughout the voting period. Gaps in walkways. Depending on the requirements in your location's checklist, election workers may place mats with metal plates where there are gaps in the walkways. The metal plate should be placed first over the gap and ensure that a Harris County stamp is facing up. Then place the rubber mat over the metal plate. If the metal plate rolls, shakes, or wobbles, the judge must remove the plate and just use the mat. Since the mats are 3 feet wide, they are to be placed horizontally along the problem areas to ensure a 3-foot wide accessible route. Ensure the mat edges lay flat. If the edges are curled, it can create a tripping hazard. At level changes, such as a curb or step, you may be directed to place plates against the level change. Place the mat over the plate according to the checklist. Sometimes the mat ends at the plate edge. Sometimes the mat covers both the plate and the level change. Follow the directions exactly as written in the checklist. Again, ensure that the ends lie flat. You may have an abrupt change in ground level. Temporary ramps may be installed when a route is interrupted with abrupt level changes, such as a step or a curb. A person who uses a wheelchair cannot ascend an abrupt level change or curb, so ramps are important to provide accessibility. Your checklist will identify whether the county's vendor is installing a temporary ramp. Judges are not responsible for installing temporary ramps, but must ensure that the ramp remains in place and is free of obstructions. If not, contact the ADA coordinator. Place cones to block off the area around the ramp so that it does not get hit or blocked by a car. Sometimes the vendor has already done this, but again, you must ensure that the cones stay in place throughout the election. Often the temporary ramp is in a parking space or in the vehicular way, so it is important to place cones around it to protect the ramp and to make sure that there is an accessible route for a voter to use the ramp. Do not push voters up a ramp unless they specifically ask for such help. Objects such as water fountains that are 27 inches to 80 inches above the floor and in an accessible route cannot protrude more than 4 inches into the accessible route. People who are blind or low vision use canes or other devices to detect barriers. If a cane-detectable barrier is not placed below the object, the voter could be injured. Judges must place a cone underneath or to either side of the protruding object. It may be necessary to place cones on either side of an object, like a water fountain, to ensure that a person can still use it. Accessible entrances and doors. A variety of items could cause a doorway or entrance to be inaccessible to a person with disabilities, such as inaccessible door hardware. For example, a doorknob. A person may not be able to grip a doorknob if the person has arthritis or multiple sclerosis. Limited room inside a vestibule. Vestibules are when multiple doors occur in a series. When there is not enough room between the doors, the remedy is to prop the door open. The door may be too heavy. Interior doors must not require more than 5 pounds to open, so heavy doors must be propped open. The area in front of the door may not be level. So when the area in front of a door is not level, a person using a wheelchair can have difficulty with both opening the door and staying in place, so the door must be propped open. There may not be enough maneuvering space to open the door. A person who uses a wheelchair may have difficulty reaching the door hardware to open the door, so if the maneuvering clearance is not large enough, the door must be propped open. If your checklist says to prop open a door, do not prop it open with a large object, such as a trash can, that obstructs the width or clearance at the door. If the door cannot be propped open, you must post an election worker to open the door for voters throughout the entire election. High thresholds and doorways can prevent a person who uses a wheelchair from passing through the door. It is particularly hard to open a door while also attempting to maneuver over a high threshold. If a doorway threshold is too high, a landing with approach ramps may be installed by the contractor on the low side of the threshold. If the landing does not provide ample maneuvering clearance, the checklist will direct the judge to prop the door open. You may be directed to place a mat with or without a plate on the low side of the threshold. If any item is placed at the threshold, you must prop the door open. Accessible entrances to the voting location must be unlocked during voting hours. If the accessible entrance is locked, the door must be propped open. If the door cannot be propped open, station an election worker to open the door. To be considered an accessible entrance, the entrance and all doors must provide minimum 32 inches clear width. If the door is too narrow and the entrance has double doors, prop both doors open. If the entrance contains a center post, remove the center post and prop both doors open. Your checklist will indicate if this is necessary. If you have any issues with removing the post, contact the ADA coordinator. At non-accessible entrances, signs must be posted directing voters to an accessible entrance. Without signs, voters with disabilities will have no way of knowing where they can enter the vote center. Ensure that signs are placed at junctions where the accessible route diverges from the main route to minimize backtracking. If your voting room requires an elevator or lift to access, test that the elevators and lifts, if present, are working properly prior to opening the polls. If not, contact the ADA coordinator immediately. If your checklist requires you to post an election worker to operate the elevator or lift, make sure they are present throughout the entire election. An election worker is needed because elevators have visible and audible signs in hallway indicating the arrival and direction of the elevator. Without this, a voter who is blind or low vision may not understand when the elevator has arrived or its direction. Elevator hallway call buttons, car controls, or signals must work. A lift must be independently operable with usable and reachable controls. In the voting area, floor surfaces must be stable, firm, and slip-resistant. Voting stations and accessible voting machines must be reachable by a voter using a wheelchair or other mobility device. This means a 3-foot wide route with no abrupt level changes such as electrical cords. At least 2 voting stations must provide adequate clear floor space, such as a circle that is at least 60 inches in diameter. Understanding how all voters arrive at the vote center, park or drop people off, move through the facility and the voting area, cast a ballot, and then reverse that process will help identify physical barriers that should be remediated. The route from the entryway to the qualifying tables to the accessible voting machine and back out again must be completely free of impediments. A key piece is location of the equipment cords. With the new voting equipment, each voting machine requires a power cord, so you will have more cords than in the past. If at all possible, set the voting room so that the cords are behind the equipment and do not cross into the voter access route. If electrical cords cannot be placed outside of the accessible route, the electrical cords must be covered with a compliant cord cover, which stabilizes the cords and provides a smooth incline and decline. The cord cover should be affixed with tape to the floor. Floor coverings such as cardboard must be removed or firmly affixed with tape to the floor. A variety of people may visit your vote center relating to ADA requirements. These include Harris County Election Day surveyors, the Harris County subject matter expert teams, and the U.S. Department of Justice teams. These teams are visiting vote centers to determine that the temporary remedies, voting room layout, and curbside voting have been set up properly and are accessible. These teams may give election workers instructions on adjustments to ensure the vote center is accessible throughout the election. Please follow their instructions. Our last topic today will be documenting complaints relating to ADA issues. In the pop-up sign totem at each location, a notice to voters with disabilities is included. This notice states, If you or a person with a disability has encountered obstacles to voting or has been discriminated against in violation of the ADA, you can file a complaint using the Disability Complaint Form. If you need assistance with filling out the form, Harris County personnel, including election judges, election workers, or employees, or the ADA coordinator will assist you. As we have discussed today, voters with disabilities have a variety of diverse needs. The notice to voters with disabilities must be viewable by voters who use wheelchairs, as well as those whose eye level is higher. This means that the notice to voters with disabilities must be posted twice, in the totem and with the other posted items not in the totem, including the sample ballot and voting instructions. The notice you are posting separately is larger and should be posted at a level that can be read by a voter who uses a wheelchair. In compliance with the notice, each early voting and election day location will have disability complaint forms available. If a voter has a complaint, provide to them the disability complaint form. The voter can complete the form or may ask you to assist them. If requested, assist the individual with filling out the form. If possible, every section should be completed. The form is also available online at harrisvotes.com. If the voter submits the form to you, it should be included in the Election Day white envelope or in the early voting return supplies box. If the voter does not want your assistance, they may complete the form themselves. The voter can submit the completed form to you or submit it through one of the methods listed on the form. Harris County will investigate the complaints, provide a written determination with a resolution, if any, forward the explanation of resolution to the complainant within 20 days, and maintain files and records relating to complaints. Complainant can request an appeal. If voters ask about the appeals process, inform them that the procedures and specific deadlines are available online at harrisvotes.com. Harris County has developed an ADA handbook that includes much of the information covered today. In the back section of the handbook is a copy of Harris County's policies and procedures relating to the ADA. Please review the handbook in its entirety prior to working in the election. Thank you for attending today's training.